Many cannabis consumers still have anxiety around the fact that the plant is still quasi-legal. Do you have any tips for knowing your rights?
Yeah, so I started actually as a criminal defense attorney.
Okay.
M- many years ago, and so this used to be sort of my, and at that time there was just medical, there was no adult use, and there were far less rights than you have today, at
Right.
least in California, right? This is different from state to state, but across the nation we're all governed by the Constitution. So the one sort of constant throughout the United States is that you have the Bill of Rights, which is the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and the Sixth Amendment. So your Fourth Amendment right is to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. How that translates is that you have the right to withhold consent for an unlawful search. Sometimes they're going to search your vehicle, your home, your person without your consent. There's nothing really that you can do about that. But the one thing that you can do is assert your right by withholding consent. And the good thing about doing that is that your lawyer later on can say, Your Honor, my client, said I do not consent, so the search is unlawful. It's not for you to decide in that moment with the police officer whether they have probable cause, whether they can conduct the search or not. That's not your job. Your job is to say, Officer, I do not consent to this search. And that's a search of your person. That's a search of your vehicle. And that's a search of your home as well. There are different rights for each type of search. So a search of your vehicle, for example, is less protected than a search of your home. So that's why they can search your car without a warrant, but they can't search your home necessarily without a warrant unless there's certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So take home, I do not consent to a search. That's the Fourth Amendment. Under the Fifth Amendment, you say, I assert my right to remain silent. That's your right to not incriminate yourself. You have to actually say, I assert my right to remain silent. If you just remain silent, that's kind of questionable,
Okay.
right? But I always express it as sort of like a light switch. Like when you say, I assert my right to remain silent, you've turned your switch on, your protection on. So anything you say thereafter is probably inadmissible in court unless you quote unquote spontaneously utter it.
Okay.
So if you say I assert my right to remain silent and the officer keeps questioning you, anything you say after that is inadmissible in court, and you kind of have this like umbrella of protection. But if you say I assert my right to remain silent and then you're sitting in the back of the police vehicle and you're like, by the way, I was smoking tons of weed and I sell it, and right, you're spontaneously saying it out of your sort of own will, then that might be admissible. So I assert my right to remain silent and then zip it, right?
Okay.
Shut the bleep up. Just don't do it. And then the Sixth Amendment is your right to an attorney. So that's your right to seek counsel. So I would say I do not consent to a search. I assert my right to remain silent, and I'd like to see my lawyer, please.
Okay. Those are the 3 lines.
Mm-hmm. And I still have it on this day on my business cards.
Okay. Yeah.
For folks, because people just in that moment, you're like, I don't know what to do. And, it's a high pressure environment. Police officers are very skilled at what they do, and it's their job to get you to actually,
self-incriminate.
Self-incriminate. That's right.
Yeah.
So they're very good at doing it. So your job is just to say those 3 things.
Yeah.
And then actually just sit there and not say anything.
Okay. So repeat after me. I do not consent to this search. I assert to remain silent, and I want to talk to my lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
Those 3 things. Memorize it.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. And you can say, or you can just say, I invoke the 5th, I invoke the 4th, and the 6th. That might even be enough if you can't remember.
4, 5, and 6. They're
4, 5, and 6. That's all you got to know. And then from there, you let your lawyer take it after the fact, right? In the moment, just you can't prevent the officer from doing whatever he or she is going to do.
Yeah. Shh. That was good. All right. The next one. Ooh. Okay. Legal tips for moms who smoke weed. Okay. All right. So I'm a mom, and there are many canna moms out there who are finally out and loud and proud in admitting that we have given up the hangovers in exchange for the joints. Do you have any legal tips for canna moms and dads?
Yes. Parenting as a cannabis consumer is different. Unfortunately, it's not comparable necessarily to drinking a glass of wine or having a bottle of wine or even a bottle of tequila around. Um, just because it is what it is.
Right.
So the agency that usually is going to be your challenge is Child Protective Services, depending on what state you're in, but that's generally the case. And they operate under a different set of rules. And generally, their guiding principle is whether there's evidence of negligence. And that's a very broad sort of
Mhm.
standard. And they have a lot of discretion. So to sort of make sure that you are not demonstrating any signs of negligence, you want to keep your cannabis locked up, out of sight, out inaccessible. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with consuming in front of your child. I think
Yeah.
that's a personal decision. I don't think that per se shows negligence or
Right.
neglect. But in some states it might, and probably not here in California. I've had some cases early in my career where moms who were about to give birth admitted to the nurse practitioner or the doctor that they had smoked during pregnancy or
Mhm.
smoked before they came to the hospital to deal with the pain, and that can be a big deal.
Yeah.
So that is something to be aware of. Because they can actually prevent the mother from breastfeeding.
Right.
And or they can ask you if you're willing to take a drug test. I say no. I would say no.
Yeah.
And that's your right, at least in California, to say no.
Okay.
So those are a couple things that you can do. And then just outside of illegal, just obviously be smart about it, right? Like
Yeah.
no driving with cannabis
Right.
and smoking. Don't let your kids get into it.
Mhm.
A lot of people get into trouble with edibles
Yeah.
because the kids get into the edibles. So that's when it's really important to keep it locked up. The actual like flower itself,
Kids are not interested in stealing your vegetables.
yeah, and it
They don't
and
care.
it just if you taste it, it's like, you know.
Yuck.
But edibles can be dangerous. I've seen a lot of cases where kids get into like a pack of edibles,
Yeah.
end up at a hospital, and luckily, nobody dies from cannabis, but
Right.
they can sort of get into like a almost coma like state
Yeah.
for a long time, for like a day or whatever, 2 days.
Mhm.
But the legal ramifications can be quite
Right.
severe.
Absolutely. THC in your child's system, the legal ramifications are high. Tips from me, make sure when you go to pick your kid up or you're going to extracurricular activities that you don't smell like it. Your eyes aren't bloodshot. Maybe you've brushed your teeth, changed your shirt. I would also say, if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, you tell no one. You tell no one, not your doctors, not a family member, not a friend. There are a lot of people who are still affected by prohibition and everything that they were taught by the DARE program. So it's best if you keep that close to who needs to know, which is probably your partner, and no one else. So you have to do what's best for your child at all times, and that includes your decision and your relationship with cannabis, but shh.
And speaking of partners, I have seen some nasty divorce cases
Oof.
where the partner will use the other partner's cannabis use as,
Mm.
in a custody case or, against them in some way. So, that's something to keep in mind as well. I have heard of that and seen that with my own eyes often.
Ugh.
So be careful with that.
I think that is the importance of a medical license as well. Kind
Hmm.
of demonstrating, like, hey, yes, I consume cannabis, but I also have medical reasons as to why I do it. So you may be consuming cannabis in California without a license, but you're using it for menopausal pain or PMS or migraines. And if you have a license, that at least kind of can explain it a bit more versus you just going to your local dispensary and exercising your right for medicine. Yeah.
Yeah, and just sort of someone claiming like, yeah, my wife or my husband is just stoned all the time with the kids. That just is not a good look in court,
Yeah.
unfortunately, and you do have to explain it away. So it's something to consider if you are going through a divorce or you have a tumultuous relationship. Maybe make it a little more private.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. That was a good. Little dialogue. Oh, Snoop. Okay. Cannabis on the move. Legality of weed in planes, trains, automobiles. Okay. All right. So a lot of people travel with their cannabis. And in fact, I heard that you can fly out of LAX with up to an ounce. How true is this?
So LAX did put out a policy where they're not going to prosecute folks that are within the California limits. They kind of then pulled that policy because a lot of people sort of took it and ran with it, you know. So you have to be careful, be mindful. The state that you're flying to might not be legal, and then anytime you're entering the federal airspace, you're technically governed by federal laws.
Yeah.
So generally, we don't see a problem with anybody who is carrying less than an ounce. The problem comes when we're really flying with a lot more than that.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've had, folks get in trouble for what looks like probably intent to sell,
Okay.
suitcases filled.
Yes.
Yeah. Suitcases filled and like those cases, what's interesting is what gets them in trouble is not the fact that they had suitcases full of weed. It's like this one guy, he had a bunch of glass jars in his carry-on.
Yeah.
And that went through TSA, and the glass jars were seen to be like a threat.
Okay.
So it wasn't the weed, it was the glass jars. So just be very careful. Something to be mindful of. I think also the batteries, you're not supposed to put them under the plane. So just be careful when it comes to that. But yeah, generally LAX is pretty lax about it. I know people fly internationally with it and have had some success. So just be mindful.
Yeah. Also, if it's in the shape of a grenade.
Oh, dang.
Maybe don't take it on the airplane. You're for sure going to get a bag inspection for your grenade-shaped pipe or glass. Just reconsider it.
Yep. Not from personal experience, right?
No.
Yeah, and then the rules for vehicles, for cars, treat it like alcohol, like you wouldn't be drinking and driving. You would put it in your trunk in a locked container or a sealed container. You can get in California, even where it's legal, you can get an open container violation if you have like an open joint in your passenger side. And then if it smells like cannabis in the car, that can often be enough for the officer to search your whole car. So, if you are smoking in the car, you might have your whole vehicle searched. So that's something to keep in mind. That's something that we see very often. So you could be facing a DUI, open container, and then possession if you have more than you're allowed to possess, possession with intent to sell if there's indicia of unlawful sales. So all of those things to keep in mind.
Okay. Well, what about if you have a medical license and you have, let's say, an open container that maybe you've consumed half of it? Are you protected with a medical license?
Not really. It should still be in the trunk.
Okay.
It should still be in the trunk or out of reach.
Okay.
Because even if you have a medical recommendation or ID card, that does not give you permission to drive intoxicated.
Okay.
So it's the same thing like as if you had an oxy prescription. You still shouldn't be driving while you're medicated. So best case is to keep it out of sight, out of mind, smell free.
Yeah.
And that's when you're gonna be the most protected.
Got it.